Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out this morning. I'm Ben White, Chief Economic Correspondent for Politico, author of the Morning Money column. It says in my script to say nice things about the Morning Money column, but I can't really say nice things about myself, so hopefully some of you read that. It covers the nexus of politics and finance. I want to thank everyone who's tuning into the live stream, folks coming in from C-SPAN, everyone following online. You can follow the discussion, hashtag Morning Money, tweet me questions. I'll ask Congressman Hoyer when we bring him out. One housekeeping item, if you have a cell phone, love to have you keep them on and tweet the event, but just put them on mute if you can, or vibrate. Delighted to have Congressman Steny Hoyer, a Democratic whip, joining us this morning. I have a lot to say about the budget situation, the continuing resolution, the debt ceiling, the Fed, other issues in the news. All that said, I'd like to thank the Peterson Foundation, who's been instrumental in helping us with these events and sponsoring these events. And here to say a few words from the foundation is Michael Peterson, President and Chief Operating Officer of the Peterson Foundation. Mr. Peterson, thank you.
Thank you, Ben. I just wanted to welcome all of you today. I apologize for losing my voice. I normally don't sound this tough and intimidating. At the Peterson Foundation, our mission is to increase awareness and accelerate action on America's long-term fiscal challenges. So we're very pleased to be working with Politico and partnering to bring these issues, these important fiscal and economic issues, to the national discussion. We hosted an earlier breakfast earlier this year with Senator Rob Portman, and today we're very pleased to have Representative Steny Hoyer with us, the House Democratic whip. And he's a leader that has earned the respect of both sides because he's willing to work to find consensus on the right policies, particularly in the fiscal area. So we're very pleased to have him here today and discuss these important issues. Later today, the CBO will be coming out with its long-term budget forecast, the update for 2013. And although there's been a lot of talk about debt and deficits over the last several years, and some progress has been made, our long-term structural challenges still remain. We've done some of the easy things, we've done some of the stupid things with the sequester, but we really haven't done a lot of the important things. And so these upcoming fiscal challenges with the debt ceiling and the continuing resolution and some of the issues that are coming in the next several weeks represent yet another opportunity to get things right and finally put the nation on a long-term fiscal path that's sustainable. And so we're very much looking forward to having Representative Steny Hoyer with us today, and we'd welcome him now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. And yeah, if you could return the mic. Thank you for making these conversations possible, and don't want to have any further delay. I'd like to introduce Steny Hoyer, Congressman and the Democratic whip.
Thank you.
Congressman, thank you for joining us. Obviously a bit of a tough day in Washington today, tragic events yesterday at the Navy Yard. I think we need to talk a little bit about that to start before we get into the fiscal matters that we'll discuss. Question for you first, is there anything new that you can tell us? Obviously you had some constituents affected by this terrible event. Anything new you can tell us this morning about what you know transpired? And then the larger question is, will this event start a new conversation about gun control? Is there anything that can be done on Capitol Hill at this point on gun control, given we've seen past efforts fail in these regards? And are there laws that are not currently on the books, that could be on the books, that would have stopped something like this from happening?
Well, frankly, Ben, I don't know enough about the facts. We'll have to find those in the coming days. I lost 3 constituents. They lost their lives that were working at the Navy Yard. 2 of whom lived in Charles County, and 1 of whom lived in St. Mary's County, the county in which I live. I'm sure that it will renew the discussions about access to weapons that can be used to kill a lot of people quickly. We have seen, however, in Colorado, just in the past weeks, 2 legislators who had the courage to vote for legislation which simply asks that we do a background check so we know who's getting guns, which 80 to 85% of the American public say is a sensible policy. Notwithstanding that, these 2 legislators were recalled in a special election. Now, one can analyze who comes out to special elections, but it does not bode well for asking people to vote for legislation similar to that which went down in the Senate. just a few months ago. So, but I'm sure it will renew the debate and the discussion, as it should.
And in terms of his access to the Navy Yard, he appeared to have security clearance despite some very troubling events in his background, the alleged shooter. Can you tell us anything about how he got that access? Is that something that you'll be looking into? It seems like there was some significant breach of security there.
I don't have additional information, but you're right. It's something that must be looked into. Again, what we have seen in so many of these instances are that the perpetrators have given previous indication of instability, even inclinations to use weapons and to talk about violence, whether they did so on a website, whether they did so with colleagues or classmates. In almost every one of these instances, we've seen the perpetrators be people who individuals thought were unstable and thought, in this case, apparently this guy was prone to violence. He had apparently shot the tires out of a neighbor's vehicle. He'd shot through the ceiling of another neighbor. This was somebody. He was given a general discharge from the Navy, so that there was no doubt that this was somebody who had a record of instability and certainly should have been, I think, subject to closer scrutiny, particularly in access to a facility such as the Navy Yard or any facility that has large numbers of people in it. That has security concerns in the United States.
Right. Well, of course, all of our thoughts and prayers go out to your constituents and their families in this difficult time. I want to switch to some of the economic and fiscal matters before us, starting with the next chairperson of the Federal Reserve. We saw Larry Summers, former Treasury Secretary, withdraw his name from consideration over the weekend. By all accounts, he was the administration's first choice, the president's first choice for chairman of the Fed. First, do you think it was the right thing for Larry Summers to do, to pull his name out of consideration? And obviously you're on the House side, but do you think had he gone up to the Senate, he could have been confirmed as Treasury Secretary?
Well, I don't know the answer to the second question. There was obviously controversy. I've had the opportunity of working very closely with Larry Summers, both when he was Deputy Secretary under Bob Rubin in the Clinton administration, and then as Secretary. I found him to be extraordinarily competent, knowledgeable, respected, and I know that the President relied heavily on him for economic advice and felt strongly about his capabilities. I have not talked to Larry Summers, but my conclusion is that he decided that the controversy that would be surrounding the confirmation or his appointment would undermine the confidence that we need to have in the Federal Reserve. And so I think in a very responsible way, he made a determination that he did not want to further politicize or create controversy within the Federal Reserve. So I think he probably did the right thing, certainly from his perspective, but he is a person of immense capability and will continue to contribute.
Do you think Fed Vice Chair Janet Yellen is the best pick for the president now that Summers is out of contention, or are there other candidates that you think would be?
I think she would be an excellent appointee. I think that she enjoys wide respect, and I think she would be somebody who would be confidence building of the Federal Reserve. But there are others as well, and this is, of course, a choice the President is going to make. And I would hope that he would make it relatively soon so that we could stabilize, because I think that given the other economic turmoil we're going to talk about, having the Federal Reserve as a stable, respected institution that gives confidence to the marketplace, very important.
Do you think that the administration has taken too long in making this appointment? One of the arguments from folks who are supportive of Larry Summers is that had they moved more quickly, some of the opposition would not have coalesced and he could have gotten through the Senate faster. Are we at a destabilizing point where this nomination not having been made is having a negative impact on the economy?
I certainly think at this point in time, making this appointment as soon as possible will be helpful.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about the coming debate over the continuing resolution. Obviously, we have very little time between now and the end of the fiscal year and the start of the 2014 fiscal year. To tie it into the summer's question, there are some who say that with the president not able to get the nominee he wanted to the Fed, unable to marshal support for a resolution in Congress, at least at first, to authorize use of force in Syria, that he's operating with a fairly weak hand at this point, and that the power center in the Democratic Party has moved to the left. Going to be very difficult for the president and Democrats in the House and Senate to come to an agreement with Republicans that continues to fund the government. First of all, do you think the president's hand is weakened now? Does he have limited support in Congress, particularly among more liberal Democrats?
No, I think the president has good support in the Congress of the United States. There was controversy clearly regarding Syria in the country. But I frankly think the president has been successful in attaining now a substantial movement on the removal of chemical weapons. It remains to be seen whether the Russians and the Syrians will be good to their word, but nevertheless, I don't think any of us would have predicted the kind of progress that's been made over the last 10 days on the issue of chemical weapons in Syria. So that I think that's been, and it was attained, in my opinion, because the president was willing to use military force to undermine the ability of the Syrian regime to use weapons and to degrade their future ability militarily. So I think that he showed resolve, and I think it's had results. The test will be in the coming weeks, of course, but the UN report that just came out confirms almost absolutely the president's representations and the intelligence community's findings. So that I think from that standpoint, he has had the imprimatur, if you will, not only of the United Nations saying chemical weapons were used, but from all the information you gleaned from their report, there seems to be an almost inescapable conclusion that it was the Syrian regime that used it. So from both standpoints. Now on the economic front, I think the president continues to enjoy some broad-based support in our side of the aisle. I think there's nobody in the Democratic Party who wants to shut down the government. The president clearly does not want to shut down the government. I think we're talking about tactics of how to make sure we don't do that.
Well, let's talk about the tactics and the substance of what might be done to avoid that shutdown. You've had a pretty hard line on eliminating the sequester as part of any continuing resolution. It's hard to see any scenario under which Republicans agree to that. So how do you get a bill out of the House that continues to fund the government? If you say Democrats won't support something that doesn't get rid of the sequester, Republicans obviously are having their own difficult time finding a vehicle to continue to fund the government that does or doesn't defund Obamacare. But is there a way to pass a bill out of the House that gets rid of the sequester at this point?
Well, my observation, Ben, has been that the Republicans have a large number of their caucus, of their conference, that are obsessively obstructionist, who are so focused on defunding Obamacare, which is something that none of their leaders reasonably believe is going to happen. And in terms of getting progress, there are many Republicans who agree with Democrats that the getting rid of Obamacare is not going to happen and that the sequester is irrational. Let me read, if I can. I'm going to call this the first book of Rogers, and I'm going to use this as my text in the coming weeks. And I will read from the first chapter, the first 2 verses. And he says this: with this action, and now this action was pulling the Transportation HUD appropriation bill, which was being passed consistent with the Republican budget from the floor because they couldn't get the votes for it. With this action, quoting Mr. Rogers, the chairman, Republican chairman, conservative for Kentucky, chairman of the Appropriations Committee, with this action, the House has declined to proceed on the implementation of the very budget it adopted just months ago. Thus, I, meaning Hal Rogers, believe that the House has made its choice. Sequestration and its unrealistic and ill-conceived discretionary cuts must be brought to an end. He goes on to say the House and Senate and White House must come together as soon as possible on a comprehensive compromise that repeals sequestration, takes the nation off this lurching path from fiscal crisis to fiscal crisis, reduces our deficits and debt, and provides a realistic top-line discretionary spending level to fund the government in a responsible and attainable way. I think Hal Rogers, the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, reflects at least half of their caucus's opinion.
Well, here endeth the lesson. On
the first day.
On the first day, right. On that question, just prognosticate for us, because it's hard for me to see how we get to a deal on this before the date of a government shutdown, given where we are at this moment. What does that deal look like in your view when we get there? What is that cap, the discretionary spending cap that you'd like to see? And just paint for us a picture of a bill that can pass the House and then get approved by the Senate that continues to fund the government. What's going to be in it? First
of all, we need to put where we are in context. In August of 2011, we adopted a Budget Control Act. That Budget Control Act cut $1.2 trillion over 10 years. Very, very substantial, probably the largest single reduction in government spending that we've had in the time I've been in Congress. That would have called for a spending level in this coming fiscal year of $1.058 trillion, which was about $110 billion less than, or almost 10%, less discretionary spending. Now, these numbers are lost on the citizens, and when they hear cut government spending, we need to get government spending under control. There is no Republican who says, and by the way, we've already cut $1.2 trillion. But that's the fact. The other figure you got is $1.043 trillion, which would be the next follow-on of that Budget Control Act for fiscal year 14, an additional cut. And then you have two other figures. The $988 billion, which is the sequester number from that 1.058 or 1.043 number, and then the 967, which is the continuing sequester number for fiscal year 14. The reason I go through that, you have four numbers. Obviously, at the low end, you have the Paul Ryan budget number of 967, which, of course, Hal Rogers says, not only does he not like it, and this is a conservative Republican in Kentucky. This is not a moderate Republican from New York or California.
God forbid.
You know, would have no credibility, right? And he says it's unattainable. What he means by unattainable, I served with Hal Rogers for a long time on the Appropriations Committee. It is inconsistent with the responsibilities of operating government at a responsible level from a conservative Republican standpoint, either on the defense side or the non-defense side. The discretionary spending. As a result, normally what you would do is the Senate has a 1.058 number, the House has a 967 number.
Split
the difference. So you're talking about 1.2, let's say, 1.02 for the sake of argument. That would be a possible compromise. Now the problem you have is you have somebody who wants to be President of the United States, Republican United States Senator, very concerned about getting back in the good graces of the Republican Party as a result of his immigration apostasy, Mark Rubio, saying, I will not vote for a CR unless it defunds Obamacare. Right. Something that clearly Mr. Rubio's got to know is not possible. Right. And an irrational request of the President of the United States to sign a bill that would do that, his signature. So, where do we find ourselves? We find ourselves with Mr. Boehner understanding that that's unreasonable, and Mr. Cantor. So they tried to construct a policy which would say to their Republican hardliners, these obsessive obstructionists, you can vote for defunding Obamacare. But we'll have a procedure so that the Senate can reject it and then pass, without sending back to us in this case, 988.
And that didn't work out.
And that didn't work out because Heritage Foundation, Freedom Works, other very conservative groups in the Republican Party on the outside were going to score this and demand their members to be, in my opinion, continuing to be obstructionists and unreasonable in what they would expect the other side and rejecting of compromise.
So,
compromise is the key.
Right.
What do I think is attainable? I think, frankly, I think Mr. Rogers and another 100 Republicans or 80 Republicans need to join the Democrats in reaching a reasonable compromise. The Democrats understand that we're not going to get our 1.058, which the Budget Control Act called for. My own view is we need to get a compromise figure, and we need to eliminate the sequester. We need to repeal the sequester. I think there are a good number of Republicans who could vote for that, but for the fact they're terrified of Tea Party opponents in primaries.
will you oppose any continuing resolution that does not cancel the sequester?
Initially, I will certainly oppose anything that goes out of the House that doesn't eliminate the sequester, because I believe the continuation of the sequester is damaging to our government, damaging to our economy, and damaging to our national security.
Let's say we get past the continuing resolution into October. We're immediately going to run into the debt ceiling issue and the Treasury running out of special moves to forestall a default and a real crisis. The debt ceiling will have to be raised by mid-October. Republicans continuing to say they will support only a debt limit increase with a commensurate dollar-for-dollar equal measure of spending cuts, also want long-term entitlement reforms. Are there any entitlement reforms on the table now that Democrats could accept as part of an agreement with Republicans that raises the debt ceiling? Change CPI?
I think the president has already offered
You think that
in
offer
his
is-
budget. And he's made it very clear that offer is on the table. As you know, Ben, I'm one of those Democrats, and I've spoken out over the last 2 or 3 years. We need a balanced big deal. We need a Domenici Rivlin, a Simpson Bowles, a Gang of Six. We need a resolution to this sporadic crisis of which Rogers talks, to get us on a fiscally sustainable path where we create a consensus that understands that we are on a path that will get us from where we are to where we need to be. Now, we ought to emphasize we've halved the budget deficit. The president said he was going to have the budget deficit in 4 years. It took him 4 years and some months. So the budget deficit is coming down. But over the long term, we need to deal with both revenues and entitlements. And both sides have very strong opponents on one side of that equation. But almost every bipartisan group that's met said, you've got to deal with both. I think that's what we have to do.
Do you think there's enough?
And that's when Rogers says we need a comprehensive resolution.
But is there Democratic support for that kind of comprehensive solution? You think that could get through both the House and the Senate?
I think there is, yeah.
Okay.
If it's comprehensive. And I will say this in the sense that when Speaker Boehner and President Obama reached, in my view, a deal.
Right.
Speaker Pelosi, Leader Reid, Mr. Durbin, and myself met with the president, and we indicated to him that we would support that deal. We didn't think it was the perfect deal. We thought there ought to be another increment of revenue to balance off any entitlement cuts, but that or reductions in growth as opposed to cuts. We would support that, and I think there is support in the
support for a deal that doesn't include any new revenue, because it's pretty clear Republicans are not going to support anything that touches revenue again. Can you get
again? If you say it's clear that they won't support any new revenue,
I don't see any reason to believe that otherwise.
Well, is it clear that Democrats won't support any restraints in entitlement growth? I don't think that's clear, and frankly, I don't think it's clear on the other side. I will tell you, I talk to Republicans, and I will not out them. Because it will be dangerous for them in their primaries, which is what they're concerned about. They're not concerned about losing to a Democrat. They're concerned about losing to a very, very conservative Republican. Let me give you an example. Delaware. Mike Castle was defeated. Indiana, Richard Lugar was defeated. Sharon Angle became the candidate in Nevada. Todd Akin in Missouri. Arguably, had moderate Republicans won any of those districts, it would have been difficult for the Democrat to win. So the problem we have getting to revenues is, yes, you're right. There have been some very hard-line stances taken on revenues. And those people were the same, many of those people were the same people that said, if we adopted the Clinton program in 1993, i.e. Dick Armey, Freedom Works, the economy was going to go down the drain. Exactly the opposite happened. We stabilized our finances, we gave confidence to the markets, and we had the best economy we've seen.
Tax reform is another issue that's critical to a lot of folks in this office, in this audience. This would be a big office. I want to bring in Rachel Bade from Politico Pro Tax, who's got a question on tax reform, and I think she's right there.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
So right now we know that House Republicans are really trying to push comprehensive tax reform. Camp is about to come out with a tax reform draft. There's also been talk about linking tax reform to the debt ceiling. Obama has proposed sort of a corporate-only tax reform. And so my question for you is, where is your caucus, where are the Democrats on reform for individuals? Do you guys, is that something you still want, even though the president has not necessarily pushed for it? And if so, what kinds of concrete steps are you guys willing to take in order to actually get reform going? Would you guys ever be open to a debt ceiling, linking it to the debt ceiling or something of that nature, for instance?
Well, let me say that on our side of the Capitol, Sandy Levin and the Democrats on the Ways and Means Committee have been participating very positively with the sort of working groups that Chairman Camp has established. I think those have been positive, they've been bipartisan, and they've been useful efforts. They have not led to an agreement, as you know, at this point in time. In my own view, we are certainly open both on the individual side as well as the corporate side to tax reform. As a matter of fact, everybody in Washington is for tax reform, right up until the time you say what it is. The tax reform, conceptually, everybody believes the tax code is too complicated, too long, too uneven in its impact on individuals and the corporate level. Warren Buffett's observation that his secretary pays a higher rate than he does is obviously something that is irrational and unacceptable. As a result, we need not only to reduce the complexity of the tax code, simplify it, but we also need to rationalize it in terms of equal effect on taxpayers, so that one taxpayer pays a higher rate, effective rate. They all might have the same nominal rate, but they pay a different effective rate than their neighbor, which obviously makes them unhappy and believing the system is unfair. So that the problem I see is that I've been in Congress for 33 years. That's not the problem, I hope. Is that I have not seen any major tax reform. I've seen tax changes, but tax reform that has not had a president and a bipartisan Congress working in league to attain it, because it is an extraordinarily difficult objective, and unless you have a large consensus and a working together of both parties and the president and the executive and the legislative body, it's almost unattainable. 1986 was the last time that really happened. That was a very significant and important step forward. We ought to be able to take another step like that, but whether or not we can in this context, I think is doubtful. If in fact there is a hostage taken on the debt limit, and that hostage is the debt limit, and the pay for is tax reform that Republicans want, as opposed to bipartisan tax reform, it's not going to work in my view. I think it's very doubtful that we'll see tax reform this year or perhaps in this Congress. But we need it, and we'd like to see it. And Democrats and Republicans are working together. You see in the Senate side where Baucus and Senator Baucus and Senator Hatch are working together. They came up with their zero-sum game to start out with. Every interest group in town was energized by that proposal.
Speaking of hostage taking, if you take hostages, the only way that scenario works is if you're willing to kill the hostage. On the debt limit, do you think there is a real risk that we get very close to the point of being unable to borrow further at the Treasury and to default, given the differences on the fiscal issues and insistence among Republicans on either defunding Obamacare or cutting spending in a way that Democrats would never expect? Wall Street, everybody I talk to there says we're going to go through the same song and dance we always go through. We'll get a CR, we'll get a debt limit increase, but then you ask them how that happens and they don't really have an answer for it. Is this a riskier scenario than we've seen previously, given how polarized the two parties seem to be right at this moment?
I think it's riskier. And I think it's riskier because what you saw in what Boehner was trying to do on the CR, and Cantor were trying to do on the CR. You saw the Heritage and Freedom Works and Club for Growth all very energized in a very hard line, we're going to score this vote mode, which, as I said, Republicans for the most part are concerned not about generals but about primaries. And they're concerned about funding from these very, very hardline right groups. Right-wing groups, incorrect groups, but right-wing groups. And I think that in that context, we're at greater risk. The irony is that Boehner and Cantor would both tell you, if they were on the stage, not extending the debt limit is an irrational, dangerous, economically devastating policy. My presumption is McConnell would say the same thing. He has said the same thing in the past. Ronald Reagan said it. And I won't read you that verse, but I've got it in my pocket.
It's enough scripture for one day.
Right. That's the scripture for another sermon. Ronald Reagan agreed on that. So that almost all the leaders, and certainly every former Republican president, believes that it's taking that hostage is a hostage you do not want to kill. Taking that hostage, that if you killed that hostage, would kill the economy and undermine the stability of the country and give to the world an extraordinarily negative view of the United States' ability to manage its own affairs. The president's made it very clear, and I agree with him. He's not going to negotiate. He's not going to negotiate with something that is fundamental to America's stability, that Republican leaders have said ought not to be put at risk. But their politics are putting it at risk. Hopefully they will retreat from that abyss.
Yeah. Want to remind folks you can tweet questions, hashtag Morning Money, and we'll take a couple of them. Take one now because I think it speaks to this, and it doesn't seem like there's any prospect that we get to a point where we're not lurching from crisis to crisis on the fiscal front, that every must-pass piece of legislation on funding the government, raising the debt ceiling, is going to be a knockdown, drag-out fight for the foreseeable future, unless there's some larger deal, unless we somehow get back to budget regular order. At Rich Walls asks, 16 years operating without a budget, only CRs. When will Congress pass one? Does it even matter? Is there any prospect for getting back to regular order on budgets and funding the government?
Well, first of all, let me make a disclosure out front. I was an appropriator for 23 years. The budget's an interesting document, but the budget really only does one thing. It can set up a reconciliation process, which is very meaningful, particularly in the Senate, not so much in the House. But what the budget does is set a top line for discretionary spending. And it gives that top line to the appropriators that then allocate that gross amount of discretionary spending between the 12 subcommittees, so that you can operate relatively easily without a budget, because the budget, once the Budget Control Act, which we passed in August of 11, set a top number for spending. Now, we believe it set the number. Republicans would argue that was the upper number and that we can do something below that. But that dispute aside, we talk a lot about budget, it gets a lot of focus, but it's the appropriation bills that actually apply money. In Maryland, from which I came for 12 years in the Senate, the budget is the budget. It is a unified document. It does the spending, but the president sends it down. The president doesn't participate in the budget process. He doesn't sign it. It's not a law in that sense. So that you don't need a budget. What you do need, however, is an appropriation process that works, that has hearings, determines priorities, determines that which is being done that doesn't need to be done, and cuts that spending out, and applies resources to things that need to be done and where we have greater opportunities. That process is broken. That process being broken undermines our stability of government. And of course, it's undermined because we don't have a context in which the budget does establish of an agreed upon spending level. And so we have this extraordinary discrepancy between the 967 of the Ryan budget and the $1.058 trillion. That's a $91 billion difference. And that's a large number to compromise. But it has led the Senate to be unable to pass an appropriation bill at their levels. And it's led us to pass 3 bills. And the interesting thing in the House, we did pass 3 bills. We passed them at the 1.058 trillion level. With the remaining bills, THUD being the one that came on, cut far below the 967 because you had to pre-fund the others. So it's clear that the budget process ought to work better, but what really must be done is the appropriation process needs to get back to a position where agreement is possible.
I want to open it up to audience questions in just a minute, so think of some good ones and we'll get a mic to you. I want to just go back to pure politics for a minute and talk about Democrats' prospects for taking back the House. The conventional wisdom is that it's impossible, not enough competitive districts for Democrats to make anywhere near the number of gains you would need. Do you think that's true? Do you see a prospect for a Democratic House in the next Congress?
Yes, I do.
That's shocking that you would say that. Well, and how do you get there exactly?
All right, let me get back to it.
Let's go district by district.
No, I'm not going to go district by district. But I am going to go back to the example I gave all of you. And I tell Charlie Cook, I said, Charlie Cook, I understand that historically you may think it's difficult for the Democrats to take back the House. What is easy, in my view, is for the Republicans to lose the House. Let me go back to Delaware. Now, these are senators. Go back to Delaware. Mike Castle wins that primary. I think Mr. Coons has a real trouble winning that election. If Mr. Lugar is renominated by the Republican Party, Joe Donnelly would have had real... I urged Joe not to run. I said, you can't beat Richard Lugar. I think I was right. The good news from Joe's standpoint, he didn't have to. Claire McCaskill was in most threatened Democratic senator in the last cycle, Todd Akin. And in Nevada, Sharon Engel. The Tea Party put Sharon Engel up as the candidate against Senator Reid, and I think was helpful to Senator Reid. So that I think what you're seeing in the Republican Party is, as I mentioned, the hard line, I would call it the radical right, is not allowing the appropriations process to go forward and threatening members, if you cooperate in any way. Mike Simpson, who I think is one of the most solid, reasonable, common sense, conservative member of the House of Representatives, chair of a subcommittee in the Appropriations Committee from Idaho, former Speaker of the Idaho Legislative House, is being contested by a Tea Party person because he's not conservative enough. Why? Because he believes that we need a balanced deal. I don't know whether Hal Rogers is going to get an opponent or not, but if they get the kind of opponents that take the hard line, I don't believe Americans are there. I don't believe independents are there. And I think that moderate Republicans and independents are going to reject this hard right, take no prisoners, shut down the government, repeal Obamacare. The repeal Obamacare, when you talk to the American public, they say, no, fix it. They may not like it, but they say, fix it, make it better, make it work for me and my family. They don't say repeal it. When you say the Republicans have been talking about repeal with no alternative for 2.5 years, they don't like that. No. So I think there is a a definite possibility that we Democrats will take back the House. Steve Israel has done a wonderful job in recruiting. We have excellent candidates around the country, and I think that we certainly have a very good chance of taking back the House.
Questions for Congressman Hoyer from the audience? We have one in the back there. If you just wait for the microphone.
Hi, Dave Kitros, LRP Publications. I just have two questions. The first, I just want to make sure, are you basically indicating that the CR that came out of the Republicans in the Appropriations Committee, that would be something that you don't believe the Democrats or particularly President Obama would support? And then I guess the second one is sort of a inside the Washington Beltway thing. There's been an issue with regards to pay raise for federal employees, and obviously that's been cut. Is there any chance of that becoming in a final version of whatever's passed, or is that probably going to have to be sacrificed again?
Well, it won't shock you to know that I'm very strongly for giving our federal employees a cost of living adjustment, not a pay raise. They're not going to get a pay raise, but a cost of living adjustment. That has historically been what we've done over the years, and we've done so in parity with the armed forces so that they move together with equality. The Republicans have abandoned that process. In my opinion, this Republican Congress and the last Republican Congress has treated federal employees worse than at any time in my career in the Congress of the United States. I think that's damaging to the federal service. It's damaging to our ability to recruit and damaging to our ability to retain the kind of talent we need in the federal government that the American people need in the federal government. So I think we are following a very unwise federal employee policy. Now let me make it clear that back in 98 and 99, I was supportive of a zero COLA at that point in time. The economy was in rough shape, people were losing their jobs, and we needed to pull our belt in a notch. And I talked to my friends in the federal employee unions, and you didn't hear much. There wasn't a great deal of controversy about that, but we're now carrying it forward. The military, on the other hand, has received raises, so that at the Pentagon you have somebody in uniform and somebody in civvies and civilian clothes working one desk next to one another, doing exactly the same job, and one receiving a cost of living adjustment and the other not. Both of their services are valued. We ought to reflect that in our policies. Secondly, and I guess I've answered them in the reverse order, I'm not sure what CR the Republicans are offering, so it's difficult to, because they don't know, in my opinion, right now. They're trying to figure out what can get the number of votes. As they did on the Farm Bill, I expect them to move right, not to the center, not to compromise. They have not been very inclined to compromise. So I expect them to move the right. I expect them to have a CR that will have, in fact, the defunding of Obamacare in it, which will perhaps garner them the votes of the hardliners in their caucus, which are 40 to 80 of them, I think, probably in that range. They will pass that, perhaps, with the requisite number of votes, although it'd be interesting what a guy like Hal Rogers does. Hal Rogers clearly does not believe. I haven't talked to him about that. That wasn't in his text, but I don't believe he thinks that's a rational policy. And in fact, you know, Senator Burr of North Carolina said that's the dumbest thing he'd ever heard of. He knows that's not going to happen. So the question is, I don't know what CR they're going to come out with, but if the CR comes out initially without repealing the sequester, which is, as I told you, I think is very harmful to the operations, effective operations of government, to the growth of the economy, and to the maintenance of our national security, then I will oppose it and would urge my members to oppose it.
I wish we had time for more audience questions. Unfortunately, I know the Congressman has a need to get back up to the Hill. You've got a little bit of work to do, I think, up there in the next few days.
You all have seen how much work we're doing up there.
Exactly. Right.
Heaven forbid that I would miss it.
Hopefully you won't adjourn today. If you could stay till Friday, we'd appreciate that. Congressman Hoyer, thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank the Peterson Foundation and thank all of you for coming out.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
sir.
Ben.
Appreciate it.
Appreciate it very much. Good.